A German shepherd once had a family, once knew love, until the day it was left behind in the middle of a storm, with no one looking back. It lay there, trembling, exhausted, waiting for something that would never come. But sometimes, fate has its own plans. A stranger, a split-second decision. And just like that, everything changed forever. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of loyalty, kindness, and the incredible power of hope. Are you ready to embark on this emotional journey? Subscribe to Dog Stories and join us as we uncover an unforgettable tale. Now let's step into the storm that changed everything. The rain poured relentlessly, lashing against the empty road like icy whips. Darkness consumed everything, except for the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off puddles scattered across the pavement. The wind howled in sharp, piercing gusts, carrying a bone-chilling cold that seemed to freeze the world in the merciless grip of the storm. On the muddy roadside, a small figure lay curled up, trembling beneath the relentless downpour. A German shepherd. Its once thick, warm coat was now matted and soaked, clinging to its frail, emaciated body. Its eyes, once full of life, had dulled, void of hope, replaced by nothing but resignation and despair. It once had a home. It once had a family. But now all it had was the endless rain and the bitter cold, as if the entire world had turned its back on it. Cold, hungry, exhausted. But more than anything, it felt the unbearable pain of being abandoned. It had run, until it could run no more. Its weary legs had carried it forward, clinging to a fading hope that the people it loved would return, that this was all just a mistake. But every passing car, every pair of headlights that pierced through the darkness, only delivered the same cruel truth. No one was coming back. The rain kept pouring, drowning it deeper into an unbearable sorrow. Its ears, once standing tall with pride, now drooped as if there was no reason left to hold them up. Hunger gnawed at its stomach, but it no longer had the strength to search for food. Waiting had taken everything from it, its body, its spirit, leaving only a weary shadow, silently awaiting the end. Time passed in a haze, stretching endlessly. Another car appeared in the distance, its headlights slicing through the storm, illuminating the small figure lying motionless on the cold, wet ground. But this time, something felt different. Would fate finally take a turn? Or was this just a fleeting glimmer of light before the darkness swallowed everything whole? Have you ever witnessed an abandoned dog? If you were in this situation, what would you do? Let Dog Stories know your thoughts in the comments below. Madeline Carter slowed her car as the rain pounded harder against the windshield, forcing the wipers to work at full speed just to clear her view. Her silver SUV rolled down the desolate, evergreen highway, its headlights cutting through the thick night, reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement. She had just finished a long shift at the veterinary clinic. It had stretched on longer than expected, and all she wanted now was to get home, curl up under a blanket, and forget about the biting cold that had seeped into her bones. But just as she was about to press the gas and leave this storm behind, something on the roadside made her freeze, a small, motionless shape curled up in the mud. She frowned. An animal? A discarded trash bag? But as she got closer, her heart clenched. A dog. Her car slowed to a stop. The rain drummed heavily on the roof, and the wind howled against the windows, almost as if warning her not to step outside. Madeline stared out through the glass, her mind racing. Should I step out? Every instinct inside her screamed that she couldn't just leave this poor creature behind. But a small, hesitant voice whispered, was it even alive? What if it was already gone? And if it was too injured to be saved, then what? Madeline lowered the window slightly, and a blast of freezing wind rushed into the car, making her shiver. That icy cold was nothing compared to what the creature outside had endured. No, she couldn't just sit here. Taking a deep breath, she switched on the hazard lights and pushed the door open. Her sneakers sank into the soaked ground, rainwater seeping through the fabric and chilling her to the bone. She moved cautiously toward the dog, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it still breathing? Madeline knelt down, her hands trembling as she reached out, barely brushing against the dog's soaked, mud-caked fur. Oh, God. Its body was too light, as if it was barely more than skin and bones. She pressed her fingers gently against its frail chest, feeling for movement, a weak rise and fall. It was still alive, but just barely. "Hey there, don't give up," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. No reaction. No whimper. Not even a flicker of an eye. And somehow, that terrified her more than anything. A wounded dog should be frightened, struggling, trying to defend itself. But this one didn't move at all. It just lay there, completely still, as if it had already given up. Madeline bit down on her lip. She didn't know who had abandoned it or what it had been through. But right now, none of that mattered. It couldn't die here. She pulled off her thick coat and carefully wrapped it around the dog's frail body. A faint warmth spread between them, barely noticeable against the relentless cold of the storm. Madeline gently slipped her hands under the dog, lifting it from the freezing ground. So light, too light. And then, as she cradled it in her arms, a tiny but powerful moment happened. A shallow sigh escaped the dog's cracked lips. It was barely a movement, but to Madeline, it meant everything. It still wanted to live. Inside the car, Madeline slammed the door shut, immediately cranking the heat to its highest setting. She carefully placed the dog, now named Bolt, onto the passenger seat, keeping the coat wrapped tightly around its fragile body. She glanced over, heart pounding. Was it breathing any stronger? She wasn't sure. The glow from the dashboard cast a dim light over its patchy fur, revealing sharp ribs jutting out and bare patches of exposed skin. The sight made her throat tighten. Abandoning a loyal dog. Who could do something like this? She wasn't expecting an answer. Only silence filled the car, except for Bolt's faint, fragile breaths and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windshield. Madeline swallowed hard, pressed the gas pedal, and headed straight home. She didn't know how much she could do for Bolt, but one thing was certain: he was no longer alone. On the way home, the SUV sped through the night, rainwater spraying up from the tires, blending with the low growl of the engine. Madeline gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes locked on the road ahead. She had to make it in time. On the passenger seat, Bolt lay motionless, his frail body still wrapped in her coat. The fabric was already soaked through, but at least it offered some warmth against the brutal cold that had nearly taken his life. Madeline stole a glance at him. Still no movement. Would she make it in time? Or was this all just a futile attempt to stop the inevitable? She bit her lip, shoving the dark thought away. No, she wouldn't let him die. Not tonight. At Madeline's home, the front door swung open, and a rush of warmth from the fireplace spilled into the freezing night air. Madeline rushed inside, still, clutching Bolt tightly in her arms. She gently laid him down on the thick blanket she had prepared by the fire. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she dropped to her knees beside him. With trembling hands, she pressed her palm lightly against his chest. Heartbeat too weak. Breathing barely there. Madeline's eyes filled with worry. He wasn't going to make it. "No, sweetheart, don't give up." Her voice echoed in the quiet room. No response. Madeline sprang into action, grabbing a dry towel and carefully patting down Bolt's drenched fur. She moved quickly but gently. His body was far too fragile for any rough handling. Then she took a bottle of warm water, soaked a cloth, and placed it over Bolt's body, hoping the warmth would help him recover. Still no movement. Time passed. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Madeline stayed awake, her gaze never leaving Bolt. She had set a bowl of fresh water near his nose, but he didn't even try to drink. A packet of soft food sat untouched. The silence in the room made her chest ache. She glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. Her eyelids felt heavy, exhaustion creeping in, but she couldn't sleep. Not now. She had promised not to leave him. Madeline reached out, gently resting her hand on Bolt's head. "Bolt, sweetheart, if you can hear me, just give me a sign." Nothing. She bit her lip hard. How could a living creature endure so much pain and still be here? Did he even want to fight anymore? If you were faced with a life on the brink of death, would you have the patience to hold on, even when you don't know what the outcome will be? A fragile moment, Madeline sighed, leaning back, her eyes never leaving Bolt. She had never felt this helpless before. And then, a tiny movement. She gasped, her heart nearly stopping. Bolt stirred. At first, just a faint twitch. But then, a fragile sigh escaped his cracked lips. Madeline bolted upright, her entire body trembling with anticipation. Bolt? No response. But then, his eyelids fluttered. She acted fast, dipping her fingertips into the bowl of water and gently dripping it onto his lips. A few seconds passed. Then, his rough, dry tongue moved, just slightly, licking the drop of water. Madeline held her breath. She stared at Bolt, her eyes burning. He wanted to live. Maybe he wasn't ready to eat yet. Maybe he couldn't even lift his head. But he was trying. Madeline ran a shaky hand over his head, her voice breaking. "That's it, Bolt. You're a fighter." There was no further response. But to Madeline, that one small movement was enough. Enough to keep fighting for him. She clenched her hands into fists, determination burning in her chest. Bolt would not die tonight. The first sunrise. After the storm, Madeline's eyes fluttered open as the soft morning light seeped through the curtains. She didn't remember when she had drifted off, only that when she jolted awake, she was still lying beside Bolt, wrapped in a thick blanket in front of the fireplace. Her heart pounded as the memories of the night before came rushing back. She immediately turned her head. Bolt was still there. He was no longer the hollow shell he had been just hours ago. His breathing was steadier. His fur, though still damp and matted, was no longer ice cold. But what made Madeline hold her breath wasn't just the sound of his breathing. It was the way he was looking at her. For the first time, his amber eyes cracked open, just slightly. Faint glimmer of something. Still weak, still fragile, but no longer empty. Madeline didn't dare blink. She swallowed, then softly whispered, "Good morning, buddy." No big reaction. But his drooping ears twitched. Madeline felt her heart nearly burst. This was the first sign. Bolt was still here. He hadn't given up. The trip to the vet an hour later, Madeline drove toward Dr. Linda Harper's veterinary clinic, the only person she trusted in a situation like this. Bolt was still too weak to stand, but as Madeline gently lifted him from the car, he was no longer completely motionless. A tiny movement. A slight twitch in his hind leg. "You're doing so well, sweetheart," she whispered. Inside the clinic, Linda was already waiting. Her face tightened the moment she saw Bolt's frail body. "Oh, my God, this little guy has been through hell." The examination. Madeline stood beside the table, watching anxiously as Linda carefully examined Bolt. She ran her hands gently over his exposed ribs, checking every visible injury. Then, her fingers stopped. Long scars stretched down Bolt's shoulder blade. Linda's expression darkened. "Madeline," she said, her voice suddenly serious. "This dog wasn't just abandoned. He was abused." Madeline froze. Linda continued, listing the findings one by one. Condition: severe malnutrition. No signs of illness, but prolonged starvation had left his body in a dangerously weakened state. Scar: not from an accident. A precise old wound, likely caused by a knife or another sharp object. Psychological state: severe loss of trust in humans. Madeline clenched her fists. Who could do something like this to such a loyal, gentle creature? Anger, sadness, a newfound determination. She wouldn't let him go through that ever again. Back at home, Madeline prepared a bowl of thin porridge, the only thing Bolt could handle right now. She placed it in front of him, but didn't force him. Silence. Madeline didn't move. She simply sat nearby, keeping enough distance to let him know she was there, but without being a threat. 3 minutes. No reaction. 5 minutes. A slight twitch of his nose. 7 minutes. Bolt tilted his head, just slightly, and looked at her. Madeline held her breath. And then, he slowly lowered his muzzle, sniffing the food. No desperation, no panic, just a small, cautious gesture. But it meant more than anything. Tears welled up in Madeline's eyes. He was trying to trust her. She smiled, her voice soft. "Good boy, Bolt. You're doing so well." She didn't expect a miracle overnight. But today, he didn't turn away. Today, he chose to try, and that was a start. Old wounds that couldn't be hidden. Madeline sat on the wooden floor, watching Bolt as he lay stretched out by the fireplace. The flames flickered, casting a soft glow over his patchy golden-brown fur. He was still thin, but his breathing was steady now, and his amber eyes no longer looked empty. She reached out, running her fingers gently along his back, until they stopped at a long scar behind his shoulder blade. She had seen it when Dr. Linda examined him, but looking closer now, something about it felt off. This wasn't an accident. The scar was too straight, too precise, too deep, as if made by a knife or another sharp object. A cold chill ran down Madeline's spine. Bolt hadn't just been abandoned. He had been deliberately hurt, her hands clenched into fists. She had to find out the truth, checking for a microchip. Most dogs in the U.S. have a microchip implanted under their skin, a small device that stores their owner's contact information. If Bolt had ever belonged to someone, this might be the way to find them. The next morning, Madeline returned to the vet clinic. Linda looked up as she walked in and gave a knowing nod. "I'm guessing you want to check if Bolt has a chip?" "Exactly." Linda grabbed a scanner and gently ran it along Bolt's neck. A small beep echoed in the room. Madeline held her breath as Linda checked the database. "There's an ID," Linda murmured. "Let me pull up the records." Madeline leaned in toward the computer screen. The data loaded painfully slow, making her feel like her heart was slowing down with it. And then, a name appeared. Registered owner, Daniel Whitmore. Madeline frowned. No current address, no updated information in the past 3 years. She glanced at Bolt. He was still lying down, motionless, but his ears twitched slightly at the mention of the name Daniel. Daniel Whitmore. Who was he? And why had Bolt been abandoned? Determined to dig deeper, Madeline snapped a photo of Bolt and posted it on local pet forums and lost animal Facebook groups. "I found this dog in critical condition on Evergreen Highway. He has an old scar and a microchip registered to Daniel Whitmore. If anyone has information about this person or the dog, please contact me." She hit post and waited. The unexpected. Call 2 days passed. No response. Madeline began to fear that no one remembered Bolt. But then, on the 3rd evening, just as she was preparing to give Bolt his medication, her phone rang. An unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "This is Madeline Carter." A deep male voice came through the line. "Are you the one who posted about the dog on Facebook?" Madeline sat up straight. "Yes." "Do you know him?" There was silence on the other end, just for a few seconds. Then, a shaky breath. "Oh, God. That's Bolt. That's my dog." Madeline froze. The man took a long breath. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I'm Daniel Whitmore. I lost him 3 years ago." Madeline sank into her chair, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can you tell me what happened?" Daniel hesitated. "Bolt wasn't just a dog," he said slowly. "He was my best friend." Madeline could hear his breath hitch as if he was trying to steady himself. "I used to be in the military," he continued. "In 2020, I was badly injured on a mission and was hospitalized at Portland Military Hospital. I was in a coma for nearly 2 months." Madeline tightened her grip on the phone. "When I finally woke up, I learned that I would never walk normally again." His voice faltered. "And when I was discharged and sent home, Bolt was gone." Madeline blinked. "Gone?" Daniel let out a dry, hollow laugh. "I think someone took him while I was in the hospital. I searched everywhere, put up flyers, contacted shelters, but no one had seen him. After a year, I thought he was dead." He took a shaky breath. "But he's still alive." His voice broke on the last word. Do you believe that no matter how much time passes, a dog will always remember its owner? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Madeline glanced, and at Bolt, now fast asleep on the soft blanket. 3 years. 3 years of wandering, waiting. If what Daniel said was true, then someone had taken Bolt, and possibly that same person had abused him. But why? And more importantly, would Bolt still remember the man who once loved him? Madeline didn't know the answer, but there was one way to find out. She took a deep breath and returned to the call. Daniel, she said slowly, do you want to see Bolt again? On the road to the reunion, Madeline checked her rearview mirror. Bolt lay still in the back seat, curled up in his blanket. The SUV moved steadily down the quiet back roads, leading toward a small suburban town where Daniel Whitmore was waiting. 3 days ago, she couldn't have imagined that Bolt had a past, that somewhere out there someone had once loved him and lost him in the most heartbreaking way. She had wondered, would Bolt remember the man he once belonged to? Had the love he once felt been erased by years of hardship and pain? Madeline blinked, shifting her focus back to the road ahead. She was about to find out. The moment of truth. As she turned into the driveway of a small house, Madeline saw a man standing on the porch. Daniel Whitmore. He was tall, likely in his early 40s, with brown hair that had begun to gray at the temples. His face was etched with tension and worry, his hands clenched tightly, eyes fixed on her car as if he couldn't look away. Madeline pulled into the driveway but didn't open the door right away. Instead, she turned back to look at Bolt. He was still lying there, head resting against the seat. No reaction. She swallowed and reached over, gently patting his back. Bolt, sweetheart, you okay? His ears twitched slightly, but he didn't lift his head. Madeline felt a wave of confusion rise in her chest. No excitement, no recognition, no reaction, like a lost dog finally finding its way home. Or maybe he didn't remember? Madeline took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Daniel was already there, standing just a few feet away. His eyes never left Bolt, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Oh, God, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Madeline opened the back door. A cold morning breeze swept through, carrying a crisp chill in the air. Bolt didn't move. Daniel crouched down, moving with such caution that it was almost as if he was afraid to touch him. Bolt, he whispered, his voice trembling. Madeline held her breath. But Bolt didn't react immediately. She saw Daniel swallow hard, his eyes glistening. Slowly, he reached out, his fingertips gently brushing over Bolt's head. Bolt, it's me, buddy. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, Bolt blinked. He took a deep breath, his nose twitching ever so slightly as he caught a familiar scent. Daniel didn't move, didn't say another word. He just waited. Then, Bolt lifted his head, his amber eyes, wider than they had been in years, locked onto Daniel. And then, he leaped. No hesitation. No fear. Just recognition. A deep, broken whimper escaped from Bolt's throat as he buried his head into Daniel's chest, as if trying to confirm this wasn't a dream. Daniel collapsed to his knees, wrapping his arms around him. Oh, God, you remember. You still remember me. Bolt pressed himself closer, his tail wagging so hard his entire frail body shook. Madeline stood there, completely speechless. 3 years. Such a long time. Yet, in just one moment, Bolt remembered everything. But things weren't that simple. After a few minutes, Daniel sat down on the porch, letting Bolt rest against his leg. He looked up at Madeline, his face filled with gratitude. Thank you. I don't even know what to say. Madeline offered a small smile. I just found him. The rest was all you. Daniel shook his head. No. If it weren't for you, I would have never seen him again. Bolt gazed up at him, eyes full of love. But then, when Daniel turned toward Madeline, Bolt looked at her the same way. A strange moment passed. Bolt had recognized his old owner, but he didn't want to leave her either. Madeline felt her throat tighten. He belonged to Daniel. But somehow, A part of him belonged to her, too. She crouched down, gently stroking his head. "You're going home now, buddy." Bolt looked at her, hesitation in his amber eyes. Daniel noticed. He took a slow breath before saying something. "Madeline, never expected. Would you want to share him?" Her head snapped up. "What?" Daniel let out a hoarse chuckle, his voice thick with emotion. "He's had 2 lives. One with me, and one with you." He ran a hand down Bolt's back. "I think he can have 2 homes." Madeline was speechless. She looked at Bolt. He was looking at both of them, his tail wagging ever so slightly. No hesitation, no fear. He had already made his decision. The first day back home, Bolt lay on a soft rug by the fireplace in Daniel's home, the glow of the flames flickering against his coat. This was where he had belonged 3 years ago. Everything was familiar. The scent of old pine wood, the faint creak of Daniel's rocking chair, even his old toys still neatly placed on the shelf. But something felt different. Daniel sat beside him, gently stroking his head. "Do you remember this place, buddy?" Bolt didn't react right away. He didn't pull away, but he also didn't curl into Daniel's lap like he once did. Something had changed. Daniel could feel it, even though Bolt was home. His eyes kept drifting toward the window, like he was waiting for something else. For someone else. A heart left. Behind Madeline drove away, but her heart stayed behind. She had done the right thing. She had brought Bolt home, where he belonged. But for some reason she couldn't shake the strange emptiness settling in her chest. All this time, she had fought to keep him alive, cared for him, waited for every sign of recovery, and now she had to walk away, leave him with the person he had once loved the most. She had no right to keep him. But then why did it feel like she was losing something important? Madeline took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the road ahead. She had done what she was supposed to do. She should be happy that Bolt had found his home. Shouldn't she? Bolt had 2 families. For the next week, Bolt's behavior was strange. He ate well, but not eagerly, as if this place still didn't quite feel like home. He stayed close to Daniel, but he wasn't attached to him like before. Every morning, he would go to the window and stare at the road, Daniel noticed. Bolt wasn't just adjusting, he was waiting for someone. One night, as Bolt curled up at Daniel's feet in the rocking chair, Daniel murmured softly, "You miss her, don't you?" No dramatic reaction, but Daniel could feel it, because he missed her too. Madeline hadn't just saved Bolt, she had become a part of his life, and Daniel knew he couldn't take that away from him. An unexpected call. That night, as Madeline was washing dishes in the kitchen, her phone rang. Daniel's number. Madeline wiped her hands dry, blinking at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hello?" Daniel's voice came through, calm but hesitant. "I think I made a mistake." Madeline didn't say anything. She just waited. Daniel took a deep breath. "Bolt. He's not the same anymore. He doesn't leave my side, but it's like he's not really here either." Madeline swallowed hard, pushing down the emotion rising in her chest. Daniel's voice softened. "Would you come visit him?" She blinked. "Are you sure?" A small chuckle came from the other end. "I think Bolt has already decided. He doesn't have just one home. A reunion that was never a goodbye." The next day, as Madeline stepped into Daniel's front yard, she didn't have to call Bolt's name. In a single second, he saw her. And then, Bolt launched toward her. No hesitation, no second guessing. He tore across the grass, sprinting straight into her arms, as if there had never been a separation at all. Madeline collapsed to her knees, wrapping her arms around him. "Oh God, you still remember me." Bolt buried his head against her neck, his tail wagging wildly, like everything he had been waiting for had finally come back. Daniel stood nearby, watching with a knowing smile. When Madeline finally looked up, Daniel spoke slowly. "I thought I was the only family he had." He looked down at Bolt, understanding shining in his eyes. "But it seems like he's found another home too." Madeline smiled, running her fingers gently over Bolt's head. "He doesn't have to choose between us." Daniel nodded. Would you want to share taking care of him? Madeline's eyes widened. You mean? Daniel shrugged. Half the time with me, half the time with you. He smiled lightly. I think we both know he can't have just one home. Madeline was stunned, but then warmth filled her heart. She looked down at Bolt, who was happily curling around her, tail wagging. He had chosen both of them, and now they had chosen him too. A new life begins. A few weeks later, Bolt's new life officially began. Half the time he lived with Daniel, enjoying peaceful days like the old times. The other half, he stayed with Madeline, exploring new adventures and experiencing a different world. And above all, he knew he would never be abandoned. Again. For the first time in 3 years, Bolt was no longer waiting in vain. Because family isn't just a place. Family is the people who never leave you, and Bolt had finally found his. Bolt had been on an unimaginable journey, from an abandoned dog, lost and freezing in a storm, to finding his way back home. But the most beautiful part of his story wasn't just reuniting with his past. It was discovering that he had not one, but two families. Two people who would love and protect him for the rest of his life. Bolt's story is a testament to loyalty, kindness, and the unconditional love that animals give to us. Despite the pain, despite being left behind, he never lost hope. Kindness can change a life. One small act can save a soul. If Madeline hadn't stopped that night, Bolt might never have had another chance. Animals aren't just pets, they're family. Bolt didn't just find a home, he found two hearts that would always be waiting for him. Time can't erase true bonds. Even after 3 years apart, Bolt still remembered his old owner. But he also knew that Madeline had become a part of his life too. And most importantly, family isn't always the place we're born into. Sometimes, family is the people who never leave us. Does Bolt's story remind you of a moment in your own life? Have you ever rescued a dog or any animal? If so, share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear your heartwarming experiences. Hit subscribe to Dog Stories and help us spread inspiring stories of loyalty, love, and lives changed by kindness. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Who knows, next time you might be the one to change a dog's life. Thank you for listening. Keep loving and protecting our four-legged friends.